I've spent my entire life fighting for justice for others, never for myself. But the day I walked into that cramped, overheated family courtroom in downtown Phoenix, I realized the law wasn't a shield anymore. Not for me. Not for my 8-year-old son, Ethan. I'm Victoria Monroe, 40 years old, an Associate Justice on the Arizona State Supreme Court, though nobody in that courtroom knew it. They only knew me as Vicky Carter, the overworked, allegedly unstable mother at the center of a messy custody battle. When the bailiff called my case, my heart pounded harder than it ever had during oral arguments before the highest court in the state. I'd presided over child welfare cases, terminated parental rights when neglect was proven, and watched children's lives hang in balance with nothing more than my ruling separating safety from danger. But this was different. My life, my son's life, was on the line. Dan sat across the aisle, crisp navy suit, smug expression, flanked by his high-priced attorney, Gregory Nash, a man who thrived on theatrics. To his left sat my mother, Margaret Monroe, the woman who raised me on discipline and sharp words, but had never quite learned how to love me softly. It still stung to see her on Dan's side. They were going to argue that I was unfit to raise Ethan. Their case hinged on one narrative, that I was unstable, secretive, and incapable of putting my son's needs before my mysterious job. It was almost laughable, the idea of being accused of hiding something sinister, but I'd made my choices carefully. The truth was, I had kept my professional life under wraps. It wasn't vanity, it was protection. Judges are lightning rods for anger. We make decisions people hate, and too often we're stalked, threatened, even harmed. My chambers were private. My home life, even more so. I wanted Ethan to have as normal a childhood as possible: soccer practices, sleepovers, Saturday cartoons, without classmates whispering that his mother was one of the most powerful judges in the state. But secrecy has a way of breeding suspicion. Dan had always hated that I wouldn't talk about certain cases, hated that I compartmentalized parts of my life. He used that frustration like a weapon now. When the judge, a family court magistrate named Evelyn Porter, called for opening statements, Gregory Nash rose dramatically, hand tucked into his vest pocket like some modern-day Hamilton, and began dismantling me with words dripping with false sympathy. "Your Honor, this isn't about vengeance. This isn't about punishing Miss Monroe. This is about Ethan, a child who deserves stability, consistency, and parents who are present." He cast a brief, calculated glance my way before continuing. "Unfortunately, Miss Monroe has demonstrated neither the emotional reliability nor the transparency necessary to be the custodial parent." It was like being cross-examined without even taking the stand. Then came my mother. She walked slowly, leaning on her cane, silver hair immaculate as always. I wanted to believe desperately that when she swore to tell the truth, she'd defend me. But I should have known better. "Vicky has always been ambitious," she began softly, her voice trembling just enough to seem fragile rather than cruel. "She's brilliant, yes, but she forgets she's a mother first, always has." She paused for effect, letting the weight of her words settle like dust on every surface. "There were times I worried about Ethan's safety. She keeps so many secrets. I've begged her to slow down, but she doesn't listen." I clenched my fists beneath the table, nails cutting into my palms, forcing myself not to react. Gregory Nash pounced, weaving her testimony into his narrative like silk threads on a loom. Dan sat there, pretending sorrow, a hand pressed to his forehead like a grieving widower, while his attorney painted me as a cold, distant career woman who placed prestige above parenthood. But I knew something they didn't. I hadn't fought my way through law school on scholarships and sleepless nights just to crumble here. I hadn't survived 10 years of trial courts, 6 years on the appellate bench, and the relentless politics of judicial confirmation hearings just to let my ex-husband and my own mother rewrite my story. The truth would come out. And when it did, I wouldn't just defend my right to raise Ethan, I'd expose the quiet manipulations driving this entire circus. Because this wasn't about my fitness as a mother. This was about control. I sat up straighter, smoothed my navy blazer, and stared straight at Dan until his eyes flickered away. He thought I was playing defense. He thought he'd win because I'd stayed silent. But I had one last move, one he could never anticipate. Tomorrow, when I called my witness chief, Justice Alan Whitmore, the courtroom would see exactly who I was. Not just a mother, not just a professional, not someone to be underestimated. A judge, a fighter, and Ethan's mother. The second day in court felt heavier than the first, like the air itself had thickened with judgment. I arrived early, hoping a quiet moment alone would steady me, but the courtroom was already humming attorneys shuffling papers, clerks whispering, the soft whir of the ceiling fans barely cutting through the heat. I took my seat at the respondent's table, smoothing the skirt of my navy suit to keep my hands occupied. Across the aisle, Dan leaned back in his chair like he already owned the outcome, his posture dripping with smug certainty. Judge Evelyn Porter entered, her expression neutral but sharp. She was younger than most judges I knew, early 40s perhaps, with a precise bob haircut and an air of no-nonsense efficiency. She wasn't one to be swayed by theatrics, but that didn't stop Gregory Nash from trying. The day began with him calling Dan to the stand. I watched as my ex-husband swore in, then glanced at me briefly, just long enough to make sure I caught the flicker of condescension in his eyes. "Mr. Carter," Nash began, adopting a tone of practiced concern, "how would you describe your co-parenting relationship with Miss Monroe?" Dan sighed deeply, playing his role. "Challenging," he said, shaking his head as though he were carrying the weight of 1,000 broken dreams. "I've tried to work with her, but Vicky's unpredictable. She keeps secrets, big ones. She's absent more often than not. I worry constantly about Ethan's emotional well-being." I bit the inside of my cheek, keeping my face neutral. If I reacted even a twitch, Nash would use it to paint me as volatile. "Can you elaborate on her absences?" Dan nodded gravely. "There were entire weekends where I couldn't reach her. Ethan would call me crying, saying Mommy was working again. And when I'd ask her where she was, she'd dodge the question. She acts like her job is more important than her own child." It took everything in me not to scoff. Those entire weekends had been late-night judicial conferences, emergency injunctions, or reviewing appellate cases that could decide someone's freedom work I couldn't disclose because of judicial ethics. I'd been sworn to confidentiality, not negligence. But none of that mattered here, not yet. Nash leaned in, lowering his voice for effect. "Do you believe Miss Monroe's secrecy impacts her ability to care for Ethan?" "I do," Dan said, voice steady, conviction rehearsed. "She's hiding something, and until we know what, I don't think she should have primary custody." I wanted to shout the truth right then and there, but instead, I scribbled notes on my legal pad, pretending to remain detached while a storm built inside me. Then Nash called my mother. Margaret Monroe, impeccable as ever in her cream-colored blazer, shuffled to the stand like she was walking into Sunday service. She'd always had this uncanny ability to make herself appear fragile and harmless, a talent I used to admire until I learned how effectively she could weaponize it. "Mrs. Monroe," Nash began gently, "you're Victoria's mother, correct?" "Yes," she said softly, "and you've been close to her throughout her life." Her lips curved into something between a smile and a grimace. "I tried to be." I braced myself. "Can you describe your concerns about your daughter's parenting?" She hesitated, glancing at me for the briefest moment before turning back to Nash. "Vicky's brilliant. Always has been. But brilliance isn't the same as stability. She has these walls. She doesn't let anyone in, not even me. I've watched her shut out family, shut out friends, and now she's shutting out Ethan." I felt the words land like stones in my chest. "And how does her career factor into this?" Nash prodded. "She's obsessed with it," my mother whispered, almost reverently. "She works constantly, disappears for hours, sometimes days. She won't say what she's doing. How can a child feel secure when his mother's life is such a mystery?" Nash's voice dropped to a sympathetic murmur. Do you believe Ethan would be better off living primarily with his father? A pause. Then softly, yes. For a moment, the room blurred. This was my mother. The woman who raised me, scolded me, pushed me toward perfection my entire life. And now she was sitting under oath, telling the court that I wasn't good enough for my son. I wanted to scream at her, to ask why she'd chosen Dan's side. But I couldn't. Because beneath the betrayal, I understood her. She wanted control. She always had. This wasn't about Ethan's well-being. It was about me refusing to live the life she wanted for me, about me daring to build my own path, my own rules, my own identity. Nash sat down, smug satisfaction plastered on his face. My attorney, Sandra Liu, stood. She was calm, deliberate, and sharp as glass. "Mrs. Monroe," she began, "you testified that Victoria keeps secrets from you, correct?" "Yes." "Could it be," Sandra pressed, "that your daughter values privacy rather than secrecy?" "I suppose." "And in your years of knowing her, have you ever once seen Victoria neglect Ethan's basic needs? Has she failed to feed him, clothe him, provide shelter, medical care, or love?" My mother hesitated the first crack in her armor. "No." Sandra nodded. "Thank you. No further questions." For the first time all day, I allowed myself a small inhale of relief. But I knew this wasn't over, because tomorrow it would be my turn. And when I called Chief Justice Alan Whitmore to the stand, the entire courtroom, Dan, Nash, my mother, even Judge Porter, would finally learn the truth about who I was. And when they did, this whole charade would shatter. The third day in court began with an odd calm. I woke before dawn, my body running on little more than adrenaline and stubbornness. For 2 nights, I'd barely slept. Ethan's picture sitting on the nightstand, his wide smile reminding me exactly what I was fighting for. When I arrived at the courthouse, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the polished marble floors reflected my nervous steps. I wasn't just walking into a courtroom today. I was walking into a battlefield. Dan was already there, lounging in his chair, like a man convinced he'd already won. Gregory Nash stood beside him, whispering strategy, likely rehearsing the same tired narrative. Vicky's unstable, Vicky's secretive, Vicky's unfit. They had no idea what was coming. Judge Evelyn Porter called the court to order. Her gaze moved between the tables, sharp as a scalpel, as if cutting through each of us to get to the truth. "Miss Monroe," she said, "you may call your next witness." I stood, feeling every pair of eyes on me, Dan's mocking, my mother's icy, Nash's calculating. I steadied my breathing, cleared my throat, and said clearly, "The defense calls Chief Justice Alan Whitmore to the stand." The reaction was immediate. Nash's head snapped toward me, his pen freezing midair. Dan's smirk faltered. My mother straightened in her seat, confusion flashing across her face. The doors at the back opened, and Chief Justice Alan Whitmore, one of the most respected jurists in the country, walked in, his presence commanding the entire room without a word. He was tall, silver-haired, wearing his signature charcoal gray suit, his expression measured but unmistakably warm when his eyes met mine. The courtroom went silent, except for the clicking of reporters' keyboards in the back row. He took the stand, raised his right hand, swore his oath, and sat. Sandra Liu, my attorney, stepped forward. "Chief Justice Whitmore, could you please state your name and position for the record?" "Alan Whitmore," he said smoothly, his deep voice filling the room. "Chief Justice of the Arizona State Supreme Court." I could practically feel Nash tense up across the aisle. Sandra continued, calm and deliberate. "Chief Justice, how long have you known Miss Monroe?" "6 years," he said. "I recruited her personally to the bench. She is currently serving as an Associate Justice of the Arizona State Supreme Court." The air in the courtroom shifted instantly, like a glass shattering in slow motion. I didn't look at Dan. I didn't need to. I could feel the weight of his disbelief radiating from across the aisle. Sandra nodded. "Can you speak to Justice Monroe's professional character?" Whitmore leaned slightly forward. "Justice Monroe is among the most capable, ethical, and dedicated jurists I have ever worked alongside. Her opinions are widely respected within the legal community, not just in Arizona, but nationally. Her record demonstrates a deep commitment to protecting the rights of families, and most notably, children. In fact, over the past decade, she has presided over and authored rulings impacting the lives of thousands of children across the state. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Whitmore continued, voice steady and unwavering. The notion that she would neglect her own child, that she would put Ethan's safety or emotional well-being at risk is absurd. If anything, Miss Monroe has sacrificed personal time, comfort, and privacy to ensure her son's safety while fulfilling her judicial duties. Her discretion is not secrecy, it is security. Sandra smiled faintly. Thank you, Chief Justice. She turned to the judge. No further questions. When Nash rose for cross-examination, I could see the panic he was trying so desperately to hide. He adjusted his tie, shuffled his papers, and attempted a measured tone. Chief Justice Whitmore, you're Miss Monroe's superior. Isn't it possible your testimony is biased? Whitmore arched an eyebrow, calm as ever. Mr. Nash, I don't risk my professional reputation on sentimentality. I am testifying under oath. If Miss Monroe were unfit, I would have said so. Nash hesitated, grasping for something, anything. Isn't it true that Miss Monroe keeps her job a secret, even from close family? Yes, Whitmore said, nodding. Because high-profile judges are often targeted. Harassment, threats, stalking, these are common. Protecting her son's anonymity is not only reasonable, it's responsible. Nash's lips parted like he wanted to argue further, but no words came. Finally, he muttered, "No further questions," and sat down heavily. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The courtroom buzzed quietly with whispers. Judge Porter banged her gavel once for silence and glanced at me. There was something different in her eyes now. Not sympathy, but respect. When Whitmore stepped down, I finally allowed myself to look at Dan. His face was pale, jaw tight, hands clenched around the edge of the table. For years, he'd believed he had the upper hand, that I was vulnerable, defenseless, just another working mom he could undermine. Now he knew the truth. I was a judge, sworn to uphold justice, and I wasn't someone to underestimate. Even my mother wouldn't meet my gaze. For the first time since this nightmare began, the power dynamic had shifted. This wasn't about defending myself anymore. This was about exposing their motives. Because now everyone in that courtroom, the judge, the attorneys, the reporters, could see it clearly. This wasn't a custody battle. This was a power struggle. And they were losing. As court adjourned for the day, I gathered my files slowly, deliberately, letting the silence hang heavy between us. When I walked past Dan's table, I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Tomorrow, Judge Porter would make her ruling, and deep down, I already knew what it would be. The final day of the hearing felt different from the start. I arrived early, Ethan's favorite blue scarf wrapped around my neck like armor. The courtroom, once hostile and suffocating, seemed strangely quiet, almost reverent. But beneath the calm, the tension simmered. I knew that by the end of the day, someone would walk out broken. Judge Evelyn Porter entered precisely at 9 o'clock. No one spoke, no one shifted. The silence was so thick, you could almost hear the sound of heartbeats echoing against the paneled walls. I sat at my table, hands folded neatly over my legal pad, trying to appear calm while my chest thudded with anticipation. Dan was across from me, his expression dark and unreadable now. The arrogance that had fueled him all week had finally cracked. Even Gregory Nash looked subdued, his swagger tempered by the weight of what Chief Justice Whitmore's testimony had done to their case. My mother sat behind them, rigid, her polished hands gripping her purse tightly. She hadn't looked at me since the day before. Judge Porter cleared her throat and began. I've reviewed all the testimony, the exhibits, and the records presented in this matter, she said, her voice steady, deliberate. This court is tasked with one obligation above all else, to determine what is in the best interests of Ethan Carter. Ethan, my son, my whole world. Porter's gaze moved between Dan and me before she continued. The petitioner, Mr. Carter, has argued that Miss Monroe's professional secrecy, long hours, and alleged instability render her unfit to serve as the primary custodial parent. The respondent, Miss Monroe, has demonstrated that her discretion stems from her role as an Associate Justice of the Arizona State Supreme Court, a fact verified by Chief Justice Whitmore's sworn testimony. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery again, though it quickly died under Porter's stern look. It is clear to this court, she went on, that Miss Monroe has provided Ethan with not only financial security, but also a safe, stable, and nurturing environment. While her professional obligations are considerable, there is no credible evidence that she has ever neglected Ethan's needs or placed him in harm's way. Dan's shoulders stiffened, his jaw tightening as though each word cut deeper. By contrast, Porter continued, the court has observed troubling indications of manipulation and animosity from the petitioner's side, including the involvement of family members in matters better handled privately. These actions appear designed less to protect Ethan than to discredit Miss Monroe's character. I inhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay composed, even as relief began to bloom in my chest. For these reasons, Judge Porter said, pausing briefly, as though letting the weight of her words settle, the court grants full physical and legal custody of Ethan Carter to Miss Victoria Monroe. Mr. Carter will receive scheduled visitation as outlined in the forthcoming parenting plan. And just like that, it was over. For a moment, I couldn't move. The words hung in the air, unreal and weightless. My attorney, Sandra, placed a hand on mine, whispering, "You did it." But all I could do was stare at the empty space on the bench, where I'd clung to every syllable of the ruling. Dan exploded first. "This is insane!" he hissed, leaning toward Nash, his voice low but sharp enough for those nearby to hear. "She lied. She manipulated everyone in this room." "Daniel," Nash warned, placing a hand on his arm, "don't." My mother stood slowly, clutching her purse to her chest. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. She glanced at me for the briefest moment, but whatever she wanted to say never made it past her lips. She turned and left without a word, her heels clicking against the tile in a steady retreat. I sat there, still as stone, until the bailiff announced, "Court is adjourned." Only then did I breathe. Sandra hugged me before leaving to file paperwork, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the weight on my chest lift. I walked out of the courtroom slowly, my steps measured, as though afraid that if I moved too quickly, the fragile reality of victory might shatter. Outside, the morning sun hit me like a revelation. I hadn't realized until that moment how long I'd been holding myself together, braced against the accusations, the betrayals, the relentless attacks on my character. I thought about Ethan. He was at school, blissfully unaware of the storm swirling around him. And that was exactly how I wanted it to stay. He didn't need to know about Dan's attempts to take him away, or his grandmother's testimony, or how close we'd come to losing everything. All he needed to know was that his home, his routines, his world, me would remain exactly where he belonged. But even in victory, the weight of the battle lingered. I couldn't ignore the sting of my mother's betrayal, nor the way Dan had weaponized my silence against me. For years, I'd believed that keeping my professional identity private was the safest thing for Ethan. But sitting in that courtroom, listening to them tear me apart piece by piece, I'd realized something deeper. Hiding my accomplishments had made it easy for people, even those closest to me, to underestimate me. I'd spent so much time shrinking parts of myself to make others comfortable, thinking humility was safer than pride. Not anymore. As I stood on the courthouse steps, I let the Arizona sun warm my face and finally allowed myself to feel everything: the anger, the exhaustion, the relief, the pride. I thought about the thousands of cases I'd ruled on, the countless children whose futures had depended on my judgments, and I realized something simple but powerful. I wasn't just Ethan's mother. I wasn't just a judge. I was a survivor. Dan would adapt. He'd still see Ethan on weekends, still call himself dad, but he'd no longer control the narrative of who I was or what I was capable of. And as for my mother, that wound would take longer to heal. But I knew one thing with certainty: her opinion of me would never again define me. Walking to my car, I thought of Ethan's laughter, his small hand in mine, and I smiled for the first time in days. This battle had nearly broken me, but it had also remade me. For the first time, I wasn't hiding anymore. I was ready to live fully as a mother, as a judge, and most importantly, as myself. It's strange how silence feels different after a storm. In the weeks following the custody ruling, my house became quieter, not just physically, but emotionally. The weight I'd been carrying for months was gone. Yet in its place was a deeper stillness, the kind that makes you pause and ask yourself hard questions. Who am I when the fighting stops? Who was I before all of this began? And who am I now? I've spent my entire adult life immersed in the law, building my career, mastering procedure, memorizing precedents, and balancing the scales of justice for others. But this case wasn't about statutes or rules of evidence. It was about me, my life, my son, my identity. And in the process of fighting for Ethan, I learned lessons I hadn't been prepared to confront. This entire ordeal forced me to face three truths about myself and about life that I'd spent years avoiding. 1. Self-respect isn't negotiable. For so long, I thought humility was strength. I believed that keeping my professional life quiet, hiding my role as a justice, was the right thing to do. I told myself it was about protecting Ethan, about shielding him from the weight of my title and the dangers that come with it. And to some extent, that was true. But there was another reason, one I wasn't ready to admit until I was standing in that courtroom. I was afraid that being honest about my position would make people see me differently. Afraid it would invite judgment, resentment, or worse, intimidation. But silence has consequences. By keeping such a defining part of myself hidden, I created space for others to define me. Dan saw it as distance. My mother saw it as instability. Gregory Nash spun it into a narrative of unfitness. And I let them because I thought staying quiet was the safest thing to do. I was wrong. Chief Justice Whitmore's testimony didn't just reveal my credentials. It reminded me of my worth. It wasn't my job title that mattered. It was the years of dedication, the decisions I'd made, the thousands of families I'd fought to protect. That wasn't something to shrink away from. I walked into that courtroom thinking I had to defend myself. I walked out realizing I never needed to. 2. Motherhood and ambition aren't opposites. One of the sharpest knives they used against me was the accusation that I prioritized my career over my child. I've thought about that a lot. It's true, my job is demanding. The hours are unpredictable. The weight of responsibility is immense. But does that make me less of a mother? Or does it make me a stronger one? For years, I carried guilt about missing soccer games, rescheduling parent-teacher conferences, and spending late nights reading case law instead of watching movies on the couch. I thought those sacrifices made me inadequate. But standing in that courtroom, hearing Nash and Dan try to twist my dedication into neglect, something inside me snapped. I've ruled on hundreds of cases involving children without homes, without advocates, without safety. I've fought tirelessly to protect them, to give them futures they never thought possible. How could I do all of that for strangers and not do the same for Ethan? I realized that my ambition isn't the enemy of my motherhood. It's the foundation of it. The hours I work, the sacrifices I make, the passion I pour into my career, all of it is for him. To give him stability, opportunity, and a role model who shows him that strength and compassion can coexist. Being a mother doesn't mean losing myself. It means showing Ethan who I really am fully, unapologetically, and without shame. 3. Family can break you and heal you. I still think about my mother's testimony. It's hard not to. I've replayed her words in my mind 100 times, trying to understand why she chose Dan's side, why she let herself become his weapon. And I've come to accept something painful. Sometimes, the people who raised you don't really see you at all. My mother's love has always come wrapped in conditions and expectations, in quiet disapproval, in disappointment masked as concern. In her mind, my success was something she should control, something she could take credit for if I lived the life she wanted for me. When I didn't, when I chose my own path, her support became conditional. Her testimony wasn't about Ethan. It was about me defying her narrative. But here's what surprised me. Despite everything, I don't hate her, because as much as her words hurt, they forced me to redefine what family means. Family isn't just blood, it's loyalty. It's love without agenda. It's the people who show up for you when everything is falling apart. The Sandras, the Chief Justices, the colleagues who called late at night to offer support, the friends who checked in when I forgot to check in with myself. Losing my mother's trust hurt, but gaining clarity about who I am and who truly stands beside me has been worth it. Before this case, I believed strength meant composure, keeping my head down, avoiding confrontation, and fighting my battles quietly. But standing in that courtroom taught me that strength sometimes looks different. It's raising your voice when others are determined to silence you. It's setting boundaries when people try to define you. It's choosing integrity even when others weaponize your silence. I fought for Ethan, but in the process, I fought for myself too. I walked into that courtroom feeling small, underestimated, and cornered. I walked out standing taller than I ever had in my life. Not because I won custody, though that victory will always mean everything to me, but because I finally stopped hiding the parts of myself I thought I had to protect. I'm not just Ethan's mother. I'm not just a judge. I'm not just the woman my ex-husband tried to dismantle, or the daughter my mother couldn't control. I'm me, entirely, finally. And that's enough. When I think back to the first day of the custody hearing, it feels like remembering a different person, a woman who was smaller, quieter, and afraid to take up too much space. I walked into that courtroom defensive, braced for attack, carrying the weight of everyone else's opinions about me. Dan's accusations, my mother's judgment, Gregory Nash's theatrics, even the silence I'd wrapped around my personal life, the very thing I thought protected me, had become a weapon they used against me. Back then, I thought my job as a judge meant I had to be untouchable, reserved, controlled, always neutral. I thought showing emotion would make me weak, and being vulnerable would make me lose. But everything changed in that courtroom. Before all of this, I was two versions of myself. There was the Judge Victoria Monroe, polished, respected, deliberate, and composed. The one who presided over complex cases and decided the fate of children, families, and entire communities. That version of me was strong on paper, admired publicly, and rarely questioned. Then there was Vicky, the mother Ethan's mom, just another parent juggling homework help, scraped knees, and bedtime stories. I worked hard to keep those two worlds separate, because I wanted Ethan to have a childhood free of pressure, free of my title, free of the dangers that sometimes come with this job. But the truth was, those versions of me had grown so far apart that even the people closest to me didn't really know who I was anymore. Dan saw me as distant. My mother saw me as unstable. And maybe, in a way, I let them. I thought keeping parts of myself hidden made me safer. In reality, it made me easier to attack. When my mother took the stand, something inside me cracked. I sat there listening to the woman who raised me, the one who taught me discipline, who pushed me to succeed, who drilled into me the importance of strength, tell the court that I was unfit to raise my son. It was like being 8 years old again, desperately trying to earn her approval, only to find that no matter how much I achieved, it was never enough. In that moment, I felt smaller than I had in years. But I also felt something else stir beneath the shame and hurt, resolve. I realized that if I stayed quiet, if I kept letting others define me, I would lose not just Ethan, but myself. The turning point came when I called Chief Justice Whitmore to the stand. Up until that moment, I'd been defending myself on their terms, letting them dictate the narrative, that I was secretive, unreliable, unfit. But when Whitmore revealed who I was, my work, my integrity, my record, the story shifted entirely. For the first time, everyone in that courtroom saw me clearly. Not the fragmented version of me they'd pieced together from assumptions and rumors, but the whole picture. A mother, a protector, a judge entrusted with the well-being of thousands of children. I stopped playing defense and started standing in my truth. By the end of the trial, I wasn't the same woman who'd walked into that courtroom. I no longer apologized for my career. I no longer shrank to make others comfortable. I stopped hiding my accomplishments as though they were something shameful. For years, I'd convinced myself that I had to choose, be the devoted mother or the respected judge. But I finally understood that I'm both, that being one doesn't diminish the other. I started showing Ethan more of my world, telling him little stories about the cases I could share, letting him see that his mother's work is about helping people, protecting them, and in doing so, I realized I wasn't just raising him, I was showing him what resilience looks like. I also started setting boundaries I'd never dared to enforce before. With Dan, with my mother, with anyone who believed they had the right to define my worth. I no longer feel the need to explain myself, not to appease someone else's ego, not to win approval I'll never get. Sometimes I replay the trial in my mind, not out of bitterness, but as a reminder. I remember the way Dan looked at me when the ruling came down, the disbelief in his eyes when he realized the narrative he'd built had crumbled. I remember my mother's silence as she left the courtroom, her heels clicking against the floor like an ending I'd long anticipated but never wanted. And I remember walking out into the sunlight that day, finally breathing freely for the first time in months. That moment wasn't just about winning custody, it was about reclaiming myself. Because the truth is, this case forced me to confront fears I'd spent years ignoring. The fear of being misunderstood, the fear of not being enough, the fear of standing fully in my power and having people resent me for it. But fear only has power when you let it silence you. And I'm done being silent. Moving forward, I'm living as my whole self. Not the fragments, not the watered-down version I thought would make me easier to love. I've learned to carry my strength without apology, my ambition without guilt, and my identity without shame. I am Ethan's mother. That will always be my greatest role. But I'm also Victoria Monroe, a woman who fought for herself when it mattered most. A woman who stopped letting other people's narratives define her. A woman who discovered that vulnerability and strength can coexist, and that boundaries aren't walls, they're protection. I used to think winning custody meant securing Ethan's future. And it does. But more than that, it gave me back the part of me that had been hiding behind fear, behind secrecy, behind the need to keep the peace at my own expense. I'm still learning, still healing, but I'm not afraid anymore. Not of judgment, not of rejection, and certainly not of being underestimated. The trial didn't just make me stronger, it made me whole. I thought the battle was over when Judge Porter granted me custody. I thought walking out of that courtroom meant stepping into peace. I was wrong. Winning custody gave me back my son and my sense of self, but it also cracked open the hidden fractures in my life. Beneath the surface of our family's drama, there were deeper currents I hadn't fully seen until the dust began to settle. The truth? The courtroom was only the first chapter. For weeks after the ruling, I avoided my mother. I couldn't face her, not after her testimony, not after the way she aligned herself with Dan. But one night, when Ethan was asleep, she called. "Vicky," she said, her voice quiet, fragile. "Can we talk?" I almost hung up, but something in her tone stopped me. She came over the next afternoon. I expected apologies, excuses, maybe even denial. Instead, she handed me a thin envelope. Worn, yellowed at the edges, my name scrawled across the front in my father's handwriting. "He gave me this before he died," she said softly. "I wasn't ready to give it to you, not until now." Inside was a letter, one that explained why my father had walked away from the bench decades ago. Threats, extortion attempts, a stalker who came too close to home. Suddenly, everything clicked. My mother's obsession with stability, her distrust of my secrecy, her fear of what my position meant. She hadn't testified against me because she wanted to take Ethan away. She'd done it because she was terrified history would repeat itself, terrified I'd become a target the way my father once was. I didn't forgive her that day, but I understood her in a way I never had before. Dan went quiet after the ruling. Too quiet. At first, I thought it was resignation. He showed up for his scheduled visits, smiled for Ethan's sake, and kept his conversations with me polite and brief. But I know Dan better than that. Silence for him isn't surrender. It's strategy. Last week, Sandra called me after reviewing some filings. Dan's attorney, Gregory Nash, had quietly submitted a motion not to change custody, but to request access to my judicial records. Officially, he claims he wants full transparency about the hours I work, the cases I preside over, and the nature of my security precautions. Unofficially, he's digging. Maybe he's looking for something to use against me. Maybe he's hoping to find a conflict of interest, a procedural misstep, anything he can twist into grounds for appeal. Or maybe, and this possibility keeps me awake at night, he's not working alone. Because Sandra uncovered something else. Nash's firm recently took on a new client, someone with deep pockets and a history of targeting judges. Someone who lost a case I presided over last year. Coincidence? I doubt it. After Chief Justice Whitmore's testimony, my private life stopped being private. The courtroom reveal went viral. Clips of Whitmore announcing my title splashed across social media, news outlets dissecting my work, strangers debating my parenting online. Ethan's teachers have started treating me differently. His classmates whisper. A reporter even showed up at my house last weekend, asking for a statement about an ongoing case. This was exactly what I'd been trying to protect Ethan from. And now it's happening. I've had to sit him down and explain things I never wanted to: why people know my name, why some of them aren't happy about the decisions I make, why we have extra locks on the doors now. I'm still navigating how to balance this new visibility with Ethan's safety, but I can't shake the fear that Dan might exploit it, or worse, that someone outside this family will. Sometimes I wonder if keeping my identity hidden for so long was actually protecting us from more than I realized. I trust Alan Whitmore. I always have. But the night after the ruling, he called me not as my mentor, not as my colleague, but as a friend. "Victoria," he said, his voice unusually tense, "I didn't tell the court everything." My heart stopped. "About what?" "There are rumblings," he said, "about a case coming down the pipeline. High profile, high stakes, and dangerous. Some of the parties involved are connected to people who don't play by the rules. You'll likely be assigned to it." I tried to press him for details, but he wouldn't say more. That conversation hasn't left my mind. I can't help but wonder, was calling him to testify my greatest victory, or the start of something much bigger than I anticipated? Ethan doesn't know the full story, not yet. But he's perceptive. Last night, as I tucked him into bed, he asked softly, "Mom, why does Grandma think you're not good enough?" It broke something in me. I told him the truth, at least part of it. That sometimes grown-ups disagree, that sometimes people we love make mistakes, and that none of it changes how much I love him. But I also realized something important. This fight wasn't just about custody. It was about legacy, about showing Ethan that strength isn't about silence or perfection. It's about standing up for yourself, even when the people closest to you don't believe in you. I want him to remember that, long after the court documents gather dust. I wish I could say the story ends here, that I won custody, learned my lessons, and we all lived quietly ever after. But the truth is, nothing feels settled. Dan isn't done. My mother's wounds and mine are still raw. My identity as a judge is no longer private, and I can already feel the ripples in my professional life. The trial gave me back my son and my voice, but it also exposed cracks in places I hadn't even realized were vulnerable. And maybe that's the real twist. Winning isn't the end. It's the beginning of a new fight, one I'm finally strong enough to face. Because for the first time in my life, I'm not hiding. Not from my title, not from my past, not from the weight of who I am. Whatever comes next, whether it's Dan's games, my mother's regrets, or the dangerous cases looming on the horizon, I know this much. I'm ready.